Welcome to the Bogosity Podcast for the 18th of July, 2011, the podcast where the best defense is good sarcasm. This is your host, Shane Killian. First, a brief update. Last week, we talked about the Casey Anthony case and what it means for justice. I mentioned the possibility that the jurors believed she was innocent, but couldn't get there beyond reasonable doubt based on the evidence. 2 jurors have now spoken out on their verdict, and they confirm that speculation. They both say they didn't believe Casey Anthony's story, but, to quote juror number 3, it's just lack of hard evidence. She also said the other jurors would say the same thing. Now, these 2 women, and probably the other jurors too, are facing threats from an irate and irrational public that just doesn't seem to get the idea that vengeance is not the correct way of doing things. Juror number 12 has fled her home state of Florida in fear for her life. Her husband has also had a traumatic time after being separated from his wife for the 44 days of the trial and deliberations. He became very concerned about her health after the verdict. He says he'll go join her if the courts or the press release her name. This is a grim reminder that even in the 21st century, for all our knowledge and advancement, we still have one foot in the dark ages. It's scary to think how easy it is that a situation like this, where there just isn't any hard evidence of someone's guilt, can easily lead to a witch hunt or lynch mob. But this is exactly why we need to abide by the rules of evidence. Imagine what it was like to be on a jury, feeling the same thing that everyone watching the news at home felt. Sympathy for Kaylee, outrage and hatred at her mother. The easy way out, the cowardly way, would have been to cave to those emotions. The hard thing, the very difficult but very important thing, is to adhere to the principles of liberty and justice when it breaks your heart to do so. And that's why all 12 members of the Casey Anthony jury are true American heroes. Now let's take a swipe at the news of the bogus. In the United States, 1 out of every 31 adults are in prison or on parole. That's the largest of any population on Earth, even bigger than China and the Soviet Union during the height of communism, even greater than both of those put together. And this is at a time when violent crimes are dropping. According to the Department of Justice, violent crime and property crime dropped over 22% over the last decade. Shouldn't that mean 22% fewer people in prison? Well, no, because most of them are in prison for non-violent, consensual, victimless crimes. Things that shouldn't even be crimes in the first place. These are people who have harmed no one, only engaged in a voluntary exchange with another adult, an exchange that our government doesn't like, such as drugs, gambling, pornography, or prostitution. If this trend continues, then by 2030, nearly 15% of American adults will be in prison or on parole. What's particularly disturbing is the racial breakdown. Although blacks are just over 10% of the population and commit less than 9% of all reported crimes, they represent 50% of the prison population. That 1 in 31 adult Americans, for blacks, becomes 1 in 11. But it's 1 in 45 for whites. What's also disturbing is the cost to you and me. $68 billion of our tax dollars are spent every year keeping these people imprisoned. That cost has increased 10% over the last decade, and that spending outpaces every other government agency except for Medicare. And that's without even considering the overcrowding problem, which has resulted in murderers, rapists, and child molesters going free so that nonviolent drug offenders can serve out their mandatory sentences. We as adults have the right to engage in whatever voluntary behavior we see fit, to gauge the risks ourselves and accept the consequences for our actions. The only time a crime is committed is when there is violence or fraud against the person or property of another. Taking people who engage in peaceful, voluntary exchanges and putting them in prison is an even bigger crime against all Americans everywhere. So we can clearly see that some of the things the government considers crimes are selling drugs, gambling, and growing vegetables in your front lawn. Yes, you heard that last part right. A woman in Oak Park, Michigan faces 93 days in jail for planting a garden in her front lawn. Julie Bass began growing the neatly manicured garden because, well, hear it from her.
We thought it would be really cool to do it so the neighbors could see. The kids love it. The kids from the neighborhood all come and help.
But the Oak Park City authorities didn't like it. They said that front yards must have, quote, suitable live plant material.
It's definitely live. It's definitely plant. It's definitely material. We think it's suitable.
And it's her yard. It's up to her to decide what's suitable for her own property. But according to Oak Park City stooge Kevin Rolkowski,
well, if you look at the definition of what suitable is in Webster's dictionary, it'll say common.
No, you self-righteous goon. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, suitable means adapted to a use or purpose. The word common appears nowhere in the definition.
So if you look around and you look in any other community, what's common to a front yard is a nice grass yard with beautiful trees and bushes and flowers.
So what this smug, bureaucratic busybody is saying is, you don't get to be an individual. You don't get to do your own thing on your own property. You have to be just like everyone else, and if you aren't, we'll put you in jail for months. A local reporter asked him this question.
What do you say to those who say, this is ridiculous?
Well, I would argue that you won't find that opinion from most people in Oak Park.
That's ridiculous.
I have a bunch of little children, and when we take walks to come by and see everything growing, I think it's a very wonderful thing for our neighborhood.
They don't have nothing else to do. They're going to take her to court for a garden.
The big reason for government intervention in our lives, over and over, is given as some form of the following argument. It's what the people want. But as this news story shows, that just isn't true.
I think it's sad that the city of Oak Park, that's already strapped for cash, is paying a lot of money to have a prosecutor bothering us.
That's not what we want to see in our front yard.
They say, why should you grow things in the front? Well, why shouldn't I? I could sell out and save my own self and just not have them bother me anymore. But then there's no telling what they're going to harass the next person about.
State and federal requirements for standardized testing are there to make sure that today's young people grow up with the skills they need to take standardized tests. How well does it work? Well, throughout Atlanta, 178 different teachers and principals have been shown to have cheated on these tests to raise student scores. It's just one of dozens of such scandals across the country. Citizens, and especially parents, express horror at this, feeling that the nation's children are being cheated. But really, all this is an indictment of how bogus these standardized testing requirements are, making all of the punishments and rewards based not on overall academic achievement, but on how well they perform on arbitrary tests. Teachers everywhere are faced with a compromise between teaching children what they need to know and teaching the test. And it doesn't help that they're pawns in a bureaucratic game. In the Atlanta scandal, an administrator told employees to tell investigators to, quote, go to hell. Complaining teachers were labeled as disgruntled, and in one case, a principal placed one under investigation for being a whistleblower. These scandals have prompted the Obama administration to reconsider No Child Left Behind. Education Secretary Arne Duncan called it a slow-motion train wreck for children's parents and teachers. Well, maybe it's time we rethink the entire concept of placing the responsibility for educating our children in the hands of politicians. It seems that police all over the country must be in some kind of contest to see who can outdo the rest at being ridiculously unjust and heavy-handed. In Madison County, Mississippi, deputies responded to a report of an attack on Daughtry Drive. When they were driving on the road, they saw a party going on. The deputies just assumed that must be the place. No one had complained about the party. No neighbors complained about the noise. There was music, but the deputies even admitted the music wasn't loud. Nonetheless, the officers immediately started handcuffing people and even tasering them. All total, 3 people were tasered and several were arrested and put in jail, even though none of them had anything to do with any kind of assault. Sheriff Toby Tobridge said that what his deputies did was just A-OK. Quote, the deputies were justified in their use of force to make the arrests and restore calm to the situation. This was a large crowd that grew unruly, and action had to be taken to get control of the scene there. But the crowd only grew unruly because your goons went in and started harassing people for no reason. They didn't restore calm. They were the only reason there wasn't calm to begin with. They arrested the partygoers for disorderly conduct, but it seems to me that the only disorderly conduct going on was from armed thugs wearing government badges who had gotten too big for their britches. The partygoers, especially the ones who were arrested, say they intend to file a complaint against the Sheriff's Department with the FBI and the ACLU. Best of luck to them. Osama bin Laden was located using proven means of intelligence gathering which have nothing to do with waterboarding or any of the other ridiculous and unlawful things our government used ostensibly to find him. One of those has got to be the most idiotic thing our government has ever done. They went to a town in Pakistan and ran a fake vaccination drive, which was really an attempt to gather DNA evidence from everyone there. What, are you people stupid? Don't we have enough to deal with from the anti-vaccine conspiracy crazies without you idiot bureaucrats giving them even more reason to intimidate people into not getting vaccinated? The Pakistani officials didn't buy it. One stated directly that there was no reason to do a vaccine drive in such a well-to-do area. All that, and they didn't even collect any DNA. Folks, our government is insane and out of control. This causes massive harm, not only to our relations with the Middle East, but also to real vaccination drives all around the world. The workers behind these drives have a lot to do, getting approval from local governments and gaining the trust of the public. And our military just undermined that. Not only that, but they also gave ammunition to the anti-vaccination forces around the world, who, as we've seen in this very podcast, have already succeeded in getting the vaccination rates in certain areas low enough for easily preventable diseases like measles and pertussis to make a comeback. In one boneheaded move, our government has probably killed an uncountable number of people around the world. Last week, we talked about how DNA evidence isn't perfect and can actually lead to false convictions. That point has been driven home in Las Vegas, where Dwayne Jackson, convicted on DNA evidence, who served 4 years in prison, is now known to have been convicted wrongfully. Turns out the DNA wasn't his, it was his cousin's. Officials found this out when the cousin was arrested in California for an unrelated crime, and his DNA was a match for the real criminal, not the one who sat 4 years in jail for a crime he didn't commit. This is one of those cases that wouldn't have been reviewed by groups like the Innocence Project since Jackson had already served his sentence, and they need to focus their limited resources on people who are still wrongfully imprisoned. But it does mean that, if your sentence is short enough, you can easily be wrongfully convicted and no one else ever know about it, and the conviction will follow you around for the rest of your life. Jackson was just lucky enough that other people just happened to come across the evidence that he was innocent. To his credit, Sheriff Doug Gillespie is working hard to make sure Jackson's name is cleared, and his department has reached a settlement with Jackson's attorneys. But get this, the investigation revealed that the phony match was the result of human error on the part of Terry Cook, the forensic scientist who handled the case. His punishment? He was placed on paid administrative leave. That's right, taxpayers are still paying to have him sit around and do nothing while officials comb through some 250 DNA cases he handled to see if there are any more innocent people harmed by his incompetence. When you or I screw up on the job, we get docked or even fired for something much more minor than this. Here is something that has led to at least one innocent person spending 4 years in prison, and they don't even dock his pay. When are government bureaucrats who screw up ever going to be held accountable for their actions? Still, Sheriff Gillespie deserves kudos for his dedication to justice and his willingness to admit mistakes when they're found. Here's hoping he becomes a role model for police and DAs all over the country, because they sure could use one. And now it's time to violate the jurisdiction of this week's biggest bogon emitter. 4 senators have called upon the Justice Department to investigate News Corporation, the parent company of Fox News, on charges of hacking cell phones and bribing public officials. What's wrong with that? Get this. The alleged crimes didn't even happen in the U.S. They happened in the UK, with reporters working for News of the World, a news outlet owned by News Corporation. Crimes that take place in other countries must be investigated and prosecuted by officials in that other country. Our government does not get to charge them with anything just because their parent company is in the U.S. And they have the audacity to charge News Corporation with breach of ethics? How about breach of justice, breach of proper jurisdiction, breach of due process? They want the DOJ to investigate to see if News Corp violated the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, specifically the part prohibiting bribery of foreign officials. But I don't see anywhere in the Constitution where Congress is given the power to break down jurisdictional barriers. Someone bribing foreign officials on American soil or while working for the American government is one thing, but people who don't even live here bribing officials in a completely different country is a reason for the U.S. to claim jurisdiction just because the company that owns them is from the U.S.? Give me a break. This is just a transparent attempt to undermine Rupert Murdoch's corporation just because they don't like what they say. Well, hey, I don't like most of what they say either, but in this country you have freedom of the press. It's enshrined in the First Amendment of our Constitution, and although Britain doesn't have a written constitution, it has an even longer tradition of a free press. That tradition is undermined by a witch hunt. If people at News of the World hacked phones and bribed officials, and their actions go beyond the free press protections afforded by the system, then by all means prosecute them for it, in Britain, under the applicable British laws, and let the people who were directly harmed by them sue in civil court. But don't misuse the system of justice to try to take down those who hold opposing opinions. As we quoted fictional lawyer Alan Shore last week, the only way you can get there is schadenfreude. And that is why, for undergoing this blatant misuse of the justice system, Senators Jay Rockefeller, Barbara Boxer, Frank Lautenberg, and Peter King are this week's biggest bogon emitters. Now it's time to go agog at the ghastliness of this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. Yes, it's more idiocy relating to the Casey Anthony verdict. This time, it's from Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, who blathered on about how the verdict means that terror suspects should not be tried in court. Here's what he said, quote, "These are not American citizens. We just found with the Caylee Anthony case how difficult it is to get a conviction in a U.S. court. They should not be in U.S. courts and before military commissions." Sorry, but as we saw last week, the Casey Anthony case is an example of the system working. Against the popular opinion, against faulty human emotion, and against mob mentality, the jury very properly determined that there just wasn't enough evidence to convict beyond all reasonable doubt. That's what's supposed to happen. If McConnell doesn't like that, it's only because he doesn't like the rules of evidence, and he wants an excuse to avoid having to actually prove that these terror suspects did anything wrong. He is completely 100% against their civil liberties, and if you don't believe me, hear it directly from him. I don't think a foreigner is entitled to all the protection in the Bill of Rights. Sorry, Senator, but it doesn't matter what you think. It only matters what the Constitution says, and it says these protections are for all people. The Constitution is very clear about what rights do and do not apply to foreigners. For example, when it mentions the right to vote in the 14th, 15th, 19th, 24th, and 26th Amendments, it specifically mentions the right of citizens, which would exclude foreigners and foreign nationals living in the U.S. But nowhere in the Bill of Rights is the word citizen even used. It's people. And as long as these terror suspects meet the basic biological requirements to be categorized as Homo sapiens, they get those rights. And you, Senator, swore an oath to that Constitution. Messing around with what you think it should say, just because it would otherwise get in the way of what you want to do, is a gross violation of that oath. Besides, there's another reason for the rules of evidence. As we discussed last week, if the rules of evidence are not upheld and an innocent person is wrongly convicted, that automatically means that the real guilty person goes free. Is that really what you want, Senator McConnell? Terrorists running around free while innocent people take their place in prisons? Or are you so arrogant as to think that you can know for a fact that these people are guilty? Let me clue you in, Senator. You are not God. You are not omnipotent. If you can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that these people are guilty, then you don't know if they're guilty or not. And it's that smug, condescending, self-aggrandizing arrogance that gets you named this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. Well, that wraps up this multi-jurisdictional edition of the Bogosity Podcast. Please visit the forums at bogosity.tv, where you can read the show notes and participate in discussions about these subjects and anything else you'd like. And if you'd like to participate in the Bogosity Podcast, you can send a question, statement, news article, or rant to podcast@bogosity.tv. If you put it in an MP3 file, it just might get played in the podcast. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. Human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle, the tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals. The Bogosity Podcast is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 3.0 Imported License.
Bogosity.